Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ron Lyons and I'm the speaker for this afternoon. And I just wanted to explain my first slide, and that's because Paul Irving said that if I spoke for more than 20 minutes, he would start throwing bread rolls. And I just wanted to put his aim off a bit. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is to really an overview of Sydney at war in the first 2.5 years of the Second World War. And it's a look at wartime Sydney from the outbreak of war in September 1939 to its rude awakening at the end of May 1942. And along the way there are some interesting contemporary parallels because we have really been at war for the past 2.5 years here, albeit without the shots, searchlights and sandbags. And what I'm going to talk about is a number of different topics, and one is what I call Australia's phony war between 1939 and 1941, when the war to most of the population here in Sydney was on the other side of the world. We'll then go from where we are now and have a snapshot of Sydney during wartime, right from where you're sitting now, out into the streets and around the harbour. Then we'll look at the Americans arriving, and then we'll look at the defences of Sydney, and then its very rude awakening on the 31st of May 1942. And so on the 3rd of September 1939, the Prime Minister Menzies announced to the nation in a radio broadcast that it is his melancholy duty to tell them that since Britain is at war with Germany, so too is Australia. And what happened was there was an immediate upsurge of war preparation amongst the civilian population. And you can see on the slide on the left of the screen there, the RSL immediately formed the Volunteer Defence Corps, which was a type of Home Guard patterned on the British Home Guard. Air Raid Precaution Organisation was started, including air raid wardens who went around making sure that people were taking the proper air raid precautions and blacking out and browning out and conducting drills. And also the schoolboys at shore were making camouflage nets as part of their wartime effort. And then in the 1940-41, our defence forces moved away from Sydney and Australia. The RAN left for the Mediterranean and UK as under Admiralty orders. The 2nd AIF was recruited and trained and leaves for the Middle East and the UK, and later of course forces went to Malaya and Rabaul and Timor. RAAF recruits sail across the Pacific to Canada to take part in the Empire Air Training Scheme and then fly with the RAF in Europe and the Middle East. And so back in Australia there's only recruits, trainees and militia left. And so what happened was that after an initial spurt of enthusiasm for war preparations, things started to wane because people saw the war as being on the other side of the world. And except for people who had family members who were part of the forces overseas, the rest of the country went back into business as usual. And the war effort waned, and so people went back to their normal pursuits. And during 1941, in October, the new Prime Minister, John Curtin, tried to emphasise what he saw as the coming threat to Australia through radio broadcasts, newspapers and public speeches. And part of it was that he said every citizen is at the service of the Commonwealth and the nation. Similarly, General Sir Thomas Blamey, the Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Military Forces, made radio broadcasts to the public telling Australians and trying to engender some sense of threat that they were like gazelles in a dell waiting for the lion to come and eat them. And if we go out of here, out from where we're sitting right now, and into the streets around Sydney during this period, we'll see a few things. And firstly, the club here operated during the war, and all these windows that you see around you wouldn't say boarded up, but they had steel plates bolted to them on the outside, which were there to firstly keep the light out, and secondly as blast protection. And indeed, some years ago during a renovation here, they were found in the basement here as well. So if we then walked out onto the streets of Sydney, you could see servicemen and civilians who were walking along and being bailed up by the ubiquitous street photographers who used to bob up out of nowhere and take your photo. And also the Sydney trams were going up and down these streets, and boy could we use a few of those right now, where the paper boys used to go along the running boards selling papers and very skillfully step across to the next tram as it passed going the opposite way and sell papers on the way back. And also life was going on as normal. Randwick races were taking place. Tomo's Two-Up School, which was never supposed to exist, continually, very adeptly kept one foot in front of the police force. And there were also things like sly grog shops for purchase of liquor after the 6 o'clock closing. Also, dancing was on at the Trocadero in George Street near the Regent Theatre, and with the famous Trocadero's revolving bandstand, which allowed two bands to be playing during the course of the night without any need for an interval. And it later on, in later years, became the venue for the Coral Sea commemoration ball. Also, if you look at the photo on the left-hand side of the screen, that was the Monash Hut, which was a services canteen which was built in Hyde Park, not far from the memorial and our home. And of course, the other photo was the tallest building in Sydney, the AWA building on York Street, which of course now is dwarfed by megalith structures. And also over on number 10 Clarence Street, a lady by the name of Violet McKenzie, who was known as Mrs. Mac, trained over 10,000 women, servicemen and mercantile mariners in Morse and semaphore signalling. And she was the first female qualified electrical engineer in Australia. Martin Place, not too far from where we are now, was used, of course, as both a parade space, a commemoration space, and a venue for things like war bond drives. And then, of course, on the 7th of December 1941, the threat got closer when the Japanese attacked the US fleet at Pearl Harbor and brought America into the war. And now the threat to Australia is real. On the 15th of February 1942, Singapore fell, and of course with it the 8th Australian Division. On 19th of February, Darwin was bombed. On the 3rd of March, Townsville was attacked. And so the threat was now getting closer and closer and closer to the population, but Sydney still felt that it was really, okay, quite a fair way from where it was all happening. And then on the 17th of March, General MacArthur arrived in Australia from the Philippines to take command of all the forces in the Southwest Pacific area. And the American headquarters in Sydney was in the old, well, what was the Grace Brothers department store building, which is now called the Grace Hotel, which is on the corner of York and Bridge Streets. But it's interesting that Pearl Harbor was attacked on the 7th of December 1941, and the first American troops arrived here on the 22nd of December 1941. We all have the idea that they came along a little bit later than that. And that was the start of the American build-up of the Yanks arriving in Australia. And they were not backward in coming forward and enjoying the facilities that Australia had to offer. And I remember my mother being terribly shocked that 2 American servicemen tried to chat her up and my grandmother when they went to the pictures at the Lyceum Theatre here in Sydney. And so they continued to form a base here for the campaign through the Pacific back to Japan. And now what I want to do is to look at the defences of Sydney. And firstly, why was it so strategic? Well, Captain Arthur Phillip was never more true when he said of the harbour that 1,000 sail of the line could anchor in perfect security. Perfect security we'll talk about in a little moment, but the strategic value of Sydney Harbour was its ability and its capacity to hold a large amount of shipping and to sustain it through things like the dry dock at Garden Island, which was the only working one south of Singapore, and Singapore had already gone, and things like Cockatoo Island, where shipbuilding took place. And it had those base facilities to handle that. And so if we look at the defences broadly from Sydney, if I can get my trusty no, having a technology failure, but anyway. If we look at it, you can see those oblong shapes out from the heads, and they were a series of electronic loops which were located on the seabed, which could detect a ship passing over them and feed back data. There were also 2 inner loops that you can see there, similarly numbers 11 and numbers 12, which went from North Head to South Head and from Watson's Bay across to Middle Head. And on the 31st of May, the 6 outer loops were inactive, and one of the 2 inner loops was on the blink, but the 6 outer loops were inactive due to the lack of trained personnel to manage them and to operate them. There was also a boom net which went across from, see if I can get this going again. The boom net went across from Watson's Bay towards Middle Head, but there was a 400 metre gap between the edge of the net and Middle Head. but it was operated by a boat, of course, which tugged across and opened the gate, opened the boom gate, so it was a boom and a net that went down to the seabed. And further up the harbour, there were various other defences and things like searchlights on the harbour. You had the Port War Station, which was a signal station at South Head, which was supposed to regulate and warn of shipping crossing and trying to get into the harbour. And so the defences continued right into the harbour, and then you had, firstly, up in the top left corner, the 9.2 guns at North Head, who were the defence against the harbour. The pylons on the bridge had anti-aircraft guns mounted on them, and that sounds really great, except that they were twin-mounted Lewis guns. And of course, the searchlight units were at various locations in the harbour, including on the roof of the convent at Rose Bay. On the water in the harbour was the Channel Patrol Group, which were a series of Halverson cruisers, which had been, of course, built at the Halverson Yards further up the Parramatta River, and they were armed with a Lewis gun mounted on the forward. Pretty precarious, I'd say, by the look of that photograph. And probably even more dangerous, depth charges in the stern, which were also a bit precarious if you had to try and fire one of those over the back of the stern of the boat. And the entire defences of Sydney were in fact controlled by the Combined Defence Headquarters, which existed under the Mitchell Library. And you access that by going in through the Conservatorium of Music and walking up the empty railway tunnels to the area under the Mitchell Library. Of course, those tunnels today are the rail line going down to Circular Quay station. And so in May of 1942, 5 what are known as I-class Japanese submarines started closing up towards the coast. And if you look at the top photo there, 2 of them had Glenn seaplanes on them. And that meant that they had a seaplane that had its wings folded back and all that sort of thing, and was carried in a hangar built into the base of the conning tower of the submarine. And it came out, or it was hauled out on rails and then fired from a catapult to take off. So the pilot really had to hope that he, really had to rely on that catapult charge. And of course the gantry crane on the top was for when he came back, and it was hoisted back on board. And one of the pilots who came back and landed but in rough sea, had to ditch the plane, was then mortified because, okay, he'd survived, but he had to go back and then explain, in his words, explain to the Emperor why he crashed his plane. And down on the bottom, more importantly, was the other 3 I-class submarines, which had the midget submarines mounted on the deck. And so during the 27th and the 29th of May 1941, the seaplanes made 2 reconnaissance flights over Sydney. And the harbour at that stage had shipping in it, which was the main element of shipping was the cruiser USS Chicago, just back from the Battle of the Coral Sea, and its destroyer escort USS Perkins, and a whole host of other ships. The harbour was chock-a-block with shipping of all kinds. And so the seaplane came up the harbour, right up over the Chicago. This is on the 29th of May, the second flight. Came up, he saw the Chicago, but mistakenly reported it as being a battleship. And then he flew back. Nobody questioned this. People thought it was the seaplanes that were carried on the deck of the Chicago on a training flight. A secret radar unit that was being tested at Iron Cove reported the flight, but they were told by the command centre that couldn't have been, it was a glitch in the radar system, because it was only new and they were testing it. So they brought that intelligence back to the submarines, and on the night of the 31st of May, Sydney had its very rude awakening when 3 submarines moved up into the harbour. The first one tried to get through the boom net. It tried to follow a Manly ferry through the boom net, but unfortunately went slightly off course and got itself stuck in the boom. And then the crew detonated the scuttling charges. The second submarine, which is the top one, M22, came up, again got past the boom net and went up into the harbour, but was discovered by a night watchman and night watchman in a rowing boat, who nobody then believed what he'd seen. He eventually convinced one of the harbour patrol boats to come and have a look, and they depth charged the submarine, and it sank with its tail up in the air in Taylor's Bay near Bradley's Head, near Taronga Zoo. The third one, M24, which is the middle one of that diagram there, got into the harbour and fired a torpedo at the Chicago and missed, but the Chicago lookouts on the Chicago saw it, and the Chicago opened fire, and that's when all hell broke loose around Sydney Harbour. Sirens went off, people started shooting all over the place. The stonework at Fort Denison took heavy casualties, and my family lived at Glebe Point near Blackwattle Bay, and I remember being told that my mother and father and grandmother and great-grandmother all got under the dining room table, and in the midst of it, because they really thought, now it's on, and in the midst of it all, my great-grandmother crawled back out because she'd forgotten her false teeth. But in preparing this, I also found out from my wife that her parents and grandparents were doing exactly the same thing at Windsor, because all the sirens and lights and searchlights and everything had gone off at RAF Richmond. And so what happened was that in the early hours of the 1st of June, M24 fired another torpedo at the Chicago, but because the pilot had reported it as a battleship, they set their torpedoes at a draft of 5 metres, when in fact the Chicago, being a cruiser, only had a draft of 4 metres. And so the torpedo went under the Chicago, but of course hit the seawall at Garden Island, exploded, and the depot ferry HMAS Cuttable was sunk with a loss of 22 lives. So Sydney at that stage was very much alert and thought the war had really come to their doorstep. And apparently the next day they had to do a survey at Taronga Park Zoo to make sure that no animals were caught in the massive amount of cross-firing across the harbour that occurred during the attack. And so both submarines were hauled out of the water, particularly the one in Taylor's Bay, which very courageous civilian divers went down into the murk and put the sling ropes around it, so you can see where they then craned it with the floating crane up out of that. And then if you look at the bottom right hand corner, you'll see a house in disarray. One of the I-class submarines, which was referred to as the mother submarine, closed with the coast and fired shells over the gap between Dover Heights and houses at Rose Bay, or house at Rose Bay, and several other locations were hit. And this caused panic, and it caused what people have referred to as an exodus towards the mountains west. And there's another interesting parallel between what we're seeing with COVID and people wanting to move away from the city. And apparently, according to locals, Lura is still referred to as Double Bay in the mountains. But Sydney had now had its rude awakening, and Sydney was no longer at war, Sydney was in the war. And so it was another 3.5 years before the war finally ended, and down near us in Martin Place, the iconic Dancing Man could be seen at the VJ celebrations. But I recall again one time when I made a very flippant comment about the war. My mother said, "But you've got to realise it was 6 years out of our lives with no end in sight." And in speaking about ends in sight, I'll close my presentation there. Thank you for your attention, and have a Merry Christmas.